Emma Robinson was long since accustomed to the fact that she had everything that an ordinary American family could ever dream of. She lived in a large, spacious house together with her husband in the suburbs of New York. Both Emma and her husband had their own cars, and that in itself was an indicator of the family's financial well-being. At the same time, few of Emma Robinson's acquaintances knew that her family life didn't start as smoothly as it may have seemed at first glance. It was now that Peter had become a popular surgeon, working in an elite clinic. But back when he met his future wife 12 years ago, he was an ordinary doctor, living in a small town in Pennsylvania and dreaming of making it big in New York. By some strange coincidence, it only became possible after Peter met Emma, who worked as a manager at a construction company at the time. The young people felt an immediate mutual attraction, which eventually led to marriage. Then, about a year after the wedding, Peter was invited to work for one of New York's clinics, which became a turning point in his career. This was partly thanks to the support of the clinic's chief physician, Walt Murphy, who Peter was friends with for a long time. It goes without saying that the move to New York changed the Robinsons' life for the better. There was just one thing that upset Emma unspeakably. More than anything else in the world, the young woman wanted to become a mother and raise a child together with the man she loved. Unfortunately, Patrick Robinson didn't share his spouse's view on the matter, and so he wasn't in any rush to have kids. The young surgeon always found a seemingly reasonable explanation for his point of view. "Honey, I still need to work on my career. I need to stand firmly on my own 2 feet first, and only then think about having kids," said Patrick, emphasizing the last word. Of course, Emma could bluntly object to her husband's words, reminding him that she was already 30 years old. On the other hand, the woman didn't want to get into a fight and make the situation even more awkward than it already was. However, the Robinson family only seemed happy, but in reality, they were anything but. This was mostly due to the fact that all of Peter's successes at the clinic came along with many late nights at work. He often came home around midnight. Of course, Emma understood perfectly well that her husband was working hard to provide their family with all the best things in life. But spending her evenings alone in front of the fireplace, she remembered the times when things were completely different. Peter himself had also changed a lot over the past 2 years. Always blaming it on how busy he was, the young surgeon didn't even seem to notice how he distanced himself from his wife and started thinking of her as a given. Peter stopped appreciating his wife, feeling that she wouldn't go anywhere. Meanwhile, Emma had noticed lipstick stains on his shirt collars numerous times. The woman was afraid to tell her husband about her suspicions, and so she continued to wear herself out with bouts of jealousy and sadness. The only person who Emma could share her grief with was her best friend, Holly Russell. Most of the time, the friends met at a cafe on the corner of Main Street, where they could chat about their lives over a cup of coffee. But this time, the conversation was all about Emma's family life. "I think that Peter is cheating on me. Sure, I never caught him red-handed, but it doesn't change anything," said Emma, embarrassed. Holly Russell had a much stronger and more confident personality than her friend, and so she always treated her as a younger sister. "Listen, honey, if you're having doubts, then you need to sort it all out once and for all. Get the evidence and throw it in his face. But that's not something you can do on your own, so I'm gonna help you out," Holly said after listening to yet more ranting from her friend. "Do you really know how to pull it off?" Emma exclaimed hopefully. Holly smiled mysteriously in response and handed her friend a business card with golden lettering on the front. Emma quickly scanned over the writing and exclaimed in response, "A private detective? How could he possibly help me? Are we going to play spies or something?" Of course not, but a detective could carry out professional surveillance on Patrick, and that alone would give some information about what your husband is actually up to, said Holly, smiling. Still doubting how useful such measures would be, Emma automatically put the business card in her pocket and quickly forgot all about it. This was explained by the fact that Patrick's birthday was coming up in a week's time, and he planned to invite the entire staff of the clinic to the party. So Emma didn't really want to ruin the celebration with her suspicions and by spying on her spouse. But having plunged into her anxious thoughts, the young woman walked down the street and, of course, didn't notice an attractive man who was standing just a few feet away from her. It was only when Emma bumped into him that she looked up in surprise and exclaimed, "Stanley, is that really you? How did you end up in New York?" In response, the tall, brown-haired man smiled and replied, "Well, the company gave me a raise, making me the head of the department, and transferred me to a different branch." Emma couldn't hide her joy, looking at the man she used to date back in college. Unfortunately, they had to break up after graduation, only getting to keep fond memories of one another. And now, looking at the love of her youth, Emma felt a painful prick in her heart, which reminded her of the feeling she once had and the painful breakup. "Are you free now? Would you like to chat a bit over a cup of coffee?" Stanley suggested cautiously. Emma shook her head in response, blaming it on some urgent business and being married, and hurried home. Meanwhile, the woman tried not to look at Stanley's surprised face, who was obviously very happy about the unexpected encounter. It's likely that Emma's quick response could be explained by the fact that she was completely devoted to her husband and didn't want to put her reputation at risk. But when she came home, she saw a note from Patrick on the table. The note read that the young surgeon was staying for a night shift at the clinic and that she shouldn't wait up for him. Crumbling the note in her hand, Emma lowered down to her knees and wept quietly. Rubbing the tears off her cheeks, she kicked herself for not going out with Stanley and not believing her friend earlier. Having finally pulled herself together, Emma took the business card out of her pocket and mustered up the courage to call the private detective. Francis Briggs turned out to be a pleasant man of about 45, who came over soon after the client's call. Having heard Emma out, he furrowed his eyebrows and offered to set up court surveillance to figure out what her husband was up to. The detective also warned Emma that it would take him at least a week to set everything up. The most surprising thing was that when Emma offered to pay the detective a retainer fee, he flat out refused. "There's nothing to pay me for yet. Now if I dig something up, then we'll discuss my fee," replied the detective. In response, Emma smiled embarrassedly and turned red right to the roots of her hair. The woman was very embarrassed to admit that she couldn't trust her husband and was forced to hire a private detective to follow him. But on the other hand, Emma realized that she couldn't continue living in a world of suspicions and lies. And so, having said goodbye to the private detective, she took a shower and went to bed with a clear conscience. Patrick, as promised, only showed up the next morning. Reeking of women's perfume and a barely noticeable scent of whiskey, he went to sleep without even undressing. Emma was hurt, but she pursed her lips and decided against making a scene, choosing to wait for the results of the investigation entrusted to Francis Briggs. A week flew by imperceptibly and brought Patrick's 35th birthday even closer. Working hard to get the house ready for the arrival of important guests, Emma even seemed to have forgotten about her suspicions regarding her husband's fidelity. The official part of the celebration was to be held in the evening, when the majority of the guests would have finished their work at the clinic. To Emma's surprise, the first person to arrive at their house was an attractive brunette in a dress with inappropriately low cleavage. Moreover, Patrick immediately started fussing around her like a moth by a burning fire. A little while later, Emma found out that the beauty's name was Pamela Murphy. Apparently, she was the wife of Walter Murphy, the former chief physician of the clinic, where Patrick had been working successfully for a few years now. This calmed Emma down a little at first, since she had pretty much decided that Pamela and her husband were having an affair. However, only a blind person wouldn't notice the desire in Patrick's eyes when he looked at the young flirt. But there was no way Emma could have foreseen what would happen next. As it turned out, Walter Murphy had rented out a nightclub to celebrate his best friend and colleague's birthday. However, the most hurtful part was that he only reserved it for the clinic's employees. So what am I supposed to do now? Stay home by myself, surrounded by a mountain of dirty dishes and empty bottles? Emma asked, offended, trying not to look at her husband's smug face. "Honey, I'm sorry, but I can't just refuse to go. He's my boss and my best friend. Don't worry, I don't even want to go there. I'll just stay for an hour or two and come home," replied Patrick, quickly looking away. At that moment, Emma understood perfectly well that her husband was flat out lying to her. She also knew that the best-case scenario was that her husband would come back early the next morning. Thus, Emma gave her husband a fake smile and kissed him goodbye. However, a great fire was blazing in the woman's soul, caused by her spouse openly lying to her face. Gazing at the cheerful procession, Emma covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. The deceived wife spent about 3 hours wallowing in sadness before she received a message from the private detective she hired. Francis Briggs messaged Emma to inform her that he had managed to collect all the necessary evidence. In confirmation of his words, the detective sent at least 24 photographs where Patrick was captured in the arms of a long-legged beauty. One could only guess how Francis Briggs managed to get those photographs. But what shocked Emma the most was that her husband's mistress was no one other than Pamela Murphy, his boss's wife. Well, that's really something. "How did you manage to get yourself into this mess, Patrick?" Emma said aloud. Meanwhile, the deceived wife's heart was full of determination, something she had never experienced before. Having studied carefully the photos provided by the detective, Emma took a desperate and irreversible step. She decided to send the photos to all of Patrick's friends, making sure not to forget the main addressee, Walt Murphy, since it was his wife who was Patrick's mistress. While sending out the compromising photos of her husband, Emma felt herself the embodiment of righteous revenge, which her husband had deserved for so long. When all the shocking messages were finally sent, the young woman started waiting for Patrick's return from the nightclub. To her immense surprise, it wasn't even 2 hours before her husband came home. Being in a state of nervous agitation, Patrick grabbed his head and locked himself in his study. Emma assured that the photos made by the private detective caused a real stir among her husband's colleagues. The woman knew that after everything that had happened, she'd never be able to share the bed with her unfaithful husband again. "Goodbye, Patrick. For now on, we're on opposing sides of this life," Emma whispered and started packing up her things. The woman knew that she was leaving into the unknown and that there was no coming back. Having closed the door behind her, Emma went towards the city center. On her way to the motel, she called Stanley, who was unspeakably happy to hear her voice. Without going into details, Emma happily informed him that she was now single and ready to start a new life. At that point, Emma Robinson didn't even think or care about the fact that just a few minutes ago, Patrick had lost his job after his best friend and mentor, Walt Murphy, received the shocking photos. At that turning point in her life, Emma felt an emotional uplift and lightness that gave her strength and a special kind of energy. Emma decided to leave all her past problems just there, in the past, and rushed to meet Stanley. Apparently, her feelings for him were more powerful than time and life circumstances. Emma knew that given the fact that her feelings towards Stanley had transcended a barrier spanning several years, choosing to build a new life with this person was the right choice to make. It's only true love that could bring her happiness and a life that would have no place for adultery and outright lies.